Good evening, Your Royal Highness, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Thank you for joining us. I'm Hania Salah, Director of the Columbia Global Center, Amman. It is my honor to welcome you to this important conversation, Faultlines and Deadlines, Rebuilding Trust in Journalism in the Age of Misinformation, with Dean and Henry R. Luce Professor of Journalism at the Columbia Journalism School, Jelani Cobb. Over the past 15 years, the Amman Global Center has been committed to fostering spaces for facilitating research, knowledge exchange, and collaboration across Jordan and the region. Through our programs, we are dedicated to partnering with local and regional institutions and individuals to address pressing issues and leverage unique opportunities. In the realm of journalism, we have organized a variety of initiatives, workshops, trainings, and public events aimed at enhancing journalistic practices and supporting media professionals. Globally, journalism faces immense challenges: trust deficits, misinformation, technological disruption, and a rapidly evolving media ecosystem. Yet within these challenges lies immense potential to harness technology for richer, authentic storytelling, to amplify diverse voices, and to forge deeper, more meaningful relationships with audiences. At Columbia Global Center Amman, we see opportunity in addressing these complexities together by fostering innovation, adaptability, and inclusion. Representation within media is critical to keep striving to share our narratives within the global media landscape. Equally vital is media literacy. In an era of information overload, equipping people with the tools to critically engage with content is foundational for trust and accountability. As we gather here, it is important to recognize the extraordinary resilience of journalists who carry out their work despite immense challenges. Their courage reminds us why journalism matters and why rebuilding trust is an essential task for all of us. That is why tonight's conversation matters deeply, to ensure that journalism thrives as a vital pillar of our societies. We are fortunate to have two remarkable guests with us tonight. Dean Jelani Cobb is an acclaimed journalist, historian, and educator. He brings invaluable insights into the disruptions facing journalism today and the opportunities to shape its future. He writes frequently about race, politics, history, and culture, offering a powerful lens through which to understand and address the challenges before us. Dean Cobb has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2015 and was a finalist for the 2018 Pulitzer Prize in Commentary. He is the author of books including The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, and is an editor of The Matter of Black Lives, an anthology of New Yorker writings on race in America. Dean Cobb serves on the board of directors of the American Journalism Project and the board of trustees of the New York Public Library. In 2023, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Giving opening remarks is Wafaa El-Sadr, the Executive Vice President of Columbia Global, and the Dr. Mathilde Krim Amfar Chair of Global Health at Columbia University, the founder and director of Global Health Center ICAP at Columbia University, and University Professor in Epidemiology and Medicine. Her vision for Columbia Global is to establish a unifying and strategic platform to promote and facilitate impactful engagement of the university's faculty, student, and alumni to enhance understanding, address global challenges, and advance knowledge and its exchange. Wafaa is an expert in global health and infectious diseases and has focused her career on advancing public health knowledge and putting that knowledge into action, establishing collaborative partnerships to strengthen health systems and engage with communities to meet health threats and improve health outcomes, especially among vulnerable populations. Professor El-Sadr is a MacArthur Fellow, a member of the National Academy of Medicine, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Advisory Committee to the Director of the National Institutes of Health. She has led numerous research studies and published widely. Before we hear from our notable guests, I would like to mention that following the talk, we will open the floor for a Q&A session, after which we invite you to join us for a reception in the courtyard. Now please join me in welcoming Professor El-Sadr.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Hania. It's great to have you all here with us today. So thank you for our guests and our friends and our supporters for coming and joining us in this very important conversation here. I want to also express my deep gratitude to Hania and to the Global Center team who really worked tirelessly to advance the mission of this Global Center and to advance the vision and the mission of the Global Center network overall. I would also like to particularly acknowledge the presence of Her Royal Highness Princess Reem. Thank you for joining us here today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit very briefly about Columbia Global. And as you can see from these signs here, essentially what we're trying to do is to have the thinking and the doing come together. People who are involved in the thinking and scholarship to be able to join with practitioners and individuals who are involved in the doing, so that through this kind of partnership we can actually advance and address some of the major challenges that the global community faces. So at its core, Columbia Global is about seeking advancing knowledge and catalyzing global engagement to address the defining challenges of our time. Columbia Global includes several very large global initiatives that have been established at Columbia University over the past 20 years, and one of those are the Global Centers. And the Global Centers really stand as a cornerstone of our vision for engagement with the world at Columbia. We try to bring the local context, the local wisdom with the global perspective to create spaces for mutual learning and dialogue. And today's event exemplifies this mission. As Hania mentioned, journalism and support of journalists has been at the core of the priorities for Columbia Global for the past several years. We recognize that journalists stand at the vanguard of documenting humanity's most critical moments, often at considerable personal risk. And our effort in this space has involved a variety of different engagements. We've had panel discussions, workshops, and skills-building initiatives that have taken place across the Columbia Global Centers. The Columbia Global Center in Paris, in Rio de Janeiro, in Santiago, Istanbul, and here in Amman, as well as on our New York City campus. And just this past year, the Amman Center here collaborated with the American University in Beirut and the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia to explore the challenge of post-conflict reporting and to also think about how to support journalists experiencing trauma through the work they do as a consequence of their witnessing some of the traumatic events that happen, that they actually report on. In addition to this, there have been various other journalism-focused panels and workshops, one focused on environmental journalism, and also another workshop that focused on, with the DART Center also, that focused on childhood development and trauma and resilience. So today we're very privileged to continue with this stream of work, to be joined by Dean Jelani Cobb, a good friend and colleague and a very good friend of Columbia Global. Thank you for coming to join us today. And as Hania mentioned, Dean Cobb is a distinguished person and of great commitment. And he's a writer, he's a historian, he's a journalist, and also he is as well a leader in the shaping of this profession, in the shaping of this discipline of journalism. So it's my honor at this point in time to welcome Dean Jelani of Columbia School of Journalism to the lectern to give us a keynote address, and then we'll engage afterwards in a discussion with all of you. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm from New York. We kind of do participatory things. So we say, good evening. I say good evening, and then you say good evening. And then you say, so good evening. There, isn't that fun? Thank you, Wafaa, for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm very happy to have the invitation from the Columbia Global Center to come here today and to spend some time with you. I'm very much appreciative of Her Royal Highness Princess Reem who was, when I became dean in 2022, was among the first people to welcome me and to reach out and to issue an initial invitation. At the time, I had so many things happening at once, I didn't know when we would find time to do this, but I'm really happy that we have been able to do so now. I'm going to solve all of the problems in the next 20 minutes or so. And at the end, we will all be amazed at how small our problems were in retrospect. No, we live, in fact, in very interesting times. We live at a moment where the profession of journalism is experiencing tectonic changes and challenges of a scale that is very difficult to find historical comparison. Most notably has been the steady decrease in trust in media organizations. And for a long time I had one understanding of this as a dynamic that was related to very particular and very specific and partisan dynamics in the United States and its politics. But in time I came to observe, as have many scholars and people who have studied this question, about the extent to which this is in fact a global problem, that we're seeing a decrease in trust in media across the board. I'm reminded of a study that the Reuters Institute did a few years back, where they found that only 38% of people across 40 different countries that they measured, only 38% of people trusted most of the news most of the time. What was troubling about this was that that study was conducted before we had technically ended the pandemic. And so at a moment where we were confronting a global pandemic brought on by a virus that was deadly in its impact across geographical boundaries, at a point where information and the quality and caliber of the information you received could make the difference between life and death. And in that very moment, we saw that there were comparatively few people who trusted in the news sources that were supposed to deliver that information to them. And so this problem is exacerbated not only by the growing distrust in news organizations, but in the growing trust, the people and outlets in which the public has increasingly bestowed its faith and given trust to, and the questionable nature of much of the information that is produced in these other kinds of outlets, on the internet, on social media, and so on. And we'll talk about that a little bit more this evening. The threats aren't simply a matter of trust, however. In addition, we see the always present possibility of violence becoming much more prevalent. And in the past year, the year that just ended, we saw, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 98 journalists killed around the world in the course of conducting their work. That year, and the year prior to it had both been record years in which there had been more journalists killed than had been in any prior year as long as they had been keeping records. And if we were to take out the astounding number of journalists who were killed in Gaza in 2023, we would still have been on pace to eclipse the number of journalists who were killed around the world in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, and so on. And so this is a global problem. In addition, the specificity that I mentioned, the Committee to Protect Journalists noted just 3 days ago that 160 journalists have died in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon since October 7th, 2023. And so I want to point out that these are not distinct crises. The escalating number of journalists who have died while conducting their work is connected to the declining degree of trust and faith that the public places in us. Literally, the less people trust us, the more vulnerable we are. And the easier it is to discredit us and to make it seem that our deaths have occurred in the course of conducting some nefarious practice on behalf of some questionable policy, but certainly in pursuit of pushing a particular agenda. If this wasn't complicated and difficult enough, we also have a moment in which we are challenged technologically. The emergence of artificial intelligence has greatly enabled the capacity of people to produce misinformation and disinformation at scale. The old saying is to believe none of what you hear and half of what you see. And in the world of mass-produced misinformation and disinformation, where audio can be produced that sounds exactly like an individual and nothing that they actually said, and video can be produced that appears to be the complete likeness of a person, although it has nothing to do with the actual person, it suggests that maybe we need to recalibrate that saying, that we believe nothing that we hear in 10% of what we see. Artificial intelligence has brought many other challenges, aside from the mere issue, the gigantic issues of disinformation and misinformation. As we saw in June of last year, in one example of a conflict between the artificial intelligence company Perplexity and Forbes magazine. Forbes magazine spent many months and put two of its best reporters into a story about Eric Schmidt, the co-founder of Google, and his initiative to create military-grade drones, and the questions of where these drones were being tested, who they were being built for, what exactly was happening with Google and these military-caliber drones. And within moments of this story being published, it was published and to great attention and great concern. But within moments of this story being published, Perplexity's AI machinery had generated a look-alike story, a complete paraphrase that paraphrased all the language, including the quotes, but made no mention of Forbes magazine. And in addition, they spun this story off into a series of social media posts which gained great attention, in fact, more attention than the original Forbes story did. And if that were not enough, they immediately produced a podcast based upon the language. If you're going to do something wrong, be shameless about it. They immediately produced a podcast, all of which outranked Forbes' original reporting. This created a great conflict over copyright and the concerns, and with protests that were raised, and Forbes highlighted the issue, and various lawyers consulted various lawyers, and Perplexity stood its ground, never took the story down, and simply said that these were the growing pains of new technologies emerging. This is particularly dangerous because investigative reporting, as I suspect many of the people in this room know, is one of the most expensive undertakings that any news organization can commit to. It requires personnel, it requires time, it often requires expertise. It sometimes requires expertise that's outside your organization, so you're bringing in forensic accountants or lawyers or people with various backgrounds, and it can very quickly run up the cost of doing this work. But news organizations do it because they believe that the right of the public to know is greater than the expense, although this is very difficult in the times of constrained budgets. Now, the payoff, in theory, is that when you do a story of that import, it will drive readers to your website and generate revenue in that way. But if we have no safeguards in that any story that features original reporting can be replicated within a moment's notice, then there's no reason for anyone to come to the site of the original reporting. And therefore, investigative reporting becomes financially unsustainable, as does much of the other kinds of work that we do. Finally, I'll say something which will likely not be news, although I think people tend not to say it so directly, which is that artificial intelligence will cost us jobs, most certainly, in the media landscape, in lots of other landscapes. We cannot escape the reality that the emergence of these technologies will result in jobs that are currently filled by human beings no longer being necessary. This is a fact, and it's something that we should grapple with directly. So now that I've laid out this sunny landscape for you, and people will say, he came all the way from New York just to depress us. I want to talk a little bit about the background of journalism and how we got to the place where we are. And I will start with the organization that I represent, Columbia Journalism School, and through that I'll weave in some of the history of American journalism, a little of the history of world journalism, and how we found ourselves in this moment. Columbia Journalism School was founded in 1912 with a bequest in the will of the newspaper publisher Joseph Pulitzer. The school was founded with one mission, which is engraved on the wall for those of you who have visited. I'm certain that Princess Reem remembers this, that on the wall in the lobby of Pulitzer it says, "To educate the next generation of journalists, to uphold the standards of excellence in journalism." And that has been our pursuit for all these many years that have intervened. The school was founded, however, for an interesting reason, one that I find to be important and one that I highlight any chance that I get. Joseph Pulitzer, who was at his time in his life the publisher of the unquestionably most powerful newspaper in the United States, it would have been the equivalent of the New York Times in his era, was fantastically wealthy, incredibly accomplished, and he founded the school not as an homage to himself and to his own accomplishments, but as a gesture of humility, because for so many years, the New York World, his newspaper, had been the standard of American journalism. And then in the mid-1890s, in the midst of a circulation war and competition with the newspapers of William Randolph Hearst, the New York Age began publishing increasingly salacious stories, trying to drive more and more public attention to their papers as opposed to their competitors, the New York Herald. The end result of this was driving the country into the Spanish-American War in 1898. And shortly thereafter, Pulitzer, in a moment of self-reflection, realized he'd long known how powerful newspapers were in shaping opinion. And he'd long been an advocate for a kind of increased ethical standard in journalism. But in the aftermath of the war, he recognized the disastrous outcomes when newspapers and news outlets stray away from their original mission, when they are tempted by the possibilities of financial gain or competition, and they place their ethical standards in the background. And in order to ensure that that would not happen, he began, in the future, he began advocating for the creation of a journalism school, which people thought was initially an absurd idea. Because journalism was considered to be a craft that was learned in the same way that someone might learn carpentry by apprenticing, and the idea that there needed to be a professionalization of journalism seemed to be far-fetched. He did that, and he also endowed the Pulitzer Prizes in order to incentivize and recognize and reward journalism that met this standard. Over the course of the 20th century, we have seen a steady evolution in how we understand journalism. It's important to recognize that journalism, both nationally in the United States and globally, has tended to evolve in the face of conflict. That is to say, that when we look at the developments in journalism, from the standards of ethics, from the standards of professionalization, and the standards of what we understand ourselves to be doing and why, it has tended to happen in the aftermath of conflicts. This happened after the First World War, where we first began to experiment with the idea of independent, or what we would now call objective news. Prior to this, in the United States at least, there were newspapers, some of which still exist, which might be the Missouri Republican or the Carolina Democrat. And these papers were associated with the actual political parties. And that begins to change after the First World War. After the Second World War, we begin to see a more modern approach to news gathering and the ethical kinds of standards of how we conduct reporting. The real kind of threshold point happens in the mid-1950s, in the midst of the Cold War, where propagandistic claims of communist subversion and the fact that people could be tainted by allegations of having communist or Marxist sympathies ran wild, and political figures would take advantage of this, notably Joseph McCarthy. And in the kind of chain of actions, the result of this was the passage in 1966 of the Freedom of Information Act, which is our equivalent in the United States of, I believe it's the access to information laws that you have here in Jordan. And that these laws began to crop up globally, where we began to recognize the idea that the public has a right to know, and that journalism has a responsibility to inform. And so we see these developments happen, kind of not necessarily synchronously, but in a general tendency toward greater professionalism, greater emphasis on ethics, and a greater understanding of the importance of journalism to the world. I should include in here in 1948, where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes in Article 19 the access to information as a human right, fundamental human right as well. And so this is the landscape that we encountered prior to all of the concerns that have begun to crop up, the things that have made us worry about the future of journalism and the future of the freedom of the press. So how should we proceed? How should we respond to the moment that we're in and the challenges that we face? At Columbia Journalism School, we have doubled and tripled down on the things that we think journalism does best and does most essentially. We have emphasized data journalism. We've emphasized investigative journalism. We've emphasized the ability to report on the climate. I say something to virtually any audience that I have a chance to address, which is, having laid out all of the concerns at the beginning of this talk, if we look past the part that frightens us, we will immediately notice a part that should be very exciting to all of us. That the questions about the business model and the questions about the proliferation of disinformation and the questions about the disruptive technologies have tended to overshadow the fact that, globally speaking, we are in a period of tremendous innovation, and that we've seen more innovation and more novel approaches and more thoughtful ideas about how journalism can and should exist than we've seen in the past 30 years prior to this, at least. And if you ask what I mean by this, just a few weeks ago, I was talking with people from a news organization called Documented, which covers immigration in the United States. And they have a fascinating approach to their coverage, which is they send text messages, SMS messages. And does a news organization exist if it's not on paper? Well, we had to confront that question at the dawn of the internet. Well, does it exist if it's not a digital website? We confront this question now, but as a mode of dissemination, if I send you a text message and tell you that the weather forecasts predict rain, and you leave your house with an umbrella, then we have done the work of news gathering and informing the public. And we see the ways in which the very devices that could potentially threaten this industry may also hold the keys to its salvation. My colleague at the journalism school, Azmat Khan, won a Pulitzer Prize 3 years ago for her coverage of civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan as a result of US military actions there. And what she found, she put on a helmet and went to the sites where US bombs fell. And then painstakingly calculated the number of people who died at each of these sites. And what she found very quickly was that the numbers of people who she found who had been killed as a result of these bombs quickly exceeded the numbers that the United States military had supplied to the United States government, that the United States government had heretofore argued were accurate numbers when the media would raise these questions. As a result of this, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. About 6 months ago, she did a demonstration of an artificial intelligence product that, once trained upon satellite images of bomb craters, was able, with stunning accuracy, to find bomb craters even in the aftermath of weathering, time passage, winds blowing soil and moving, was still, with a stunning degree of accuracy, able to identify bomb craters, even those that would not have been accessible to her, that she would not have been able to get to physically. And she could do this from the comfort of her own office. And so it would allow us to do this kind of work, not only with a greater degree of accuracy, but with a greater degree of safety. And so, in talking with a leader in American business about the concerns of artificial intelligence ending jobs and costing jobs, and there being fewer positions for people, this person said to me, who was a person who's very highly placed in the American business world, and he said to me, do you know what cost a lot of jobs, what really got rid of a lot of jobs in the United States? And I said, what? He said, the invention of the tractor. He said, if you wanted to create jobs, pass a law that forbade the use of tractors in any agriculture. He said, see how eager people would be to go back to the era where all crops were manually harvested. It's not something that we would even think about. It was like, the fact of it is that this technology will change the employment landscape, but we should be thinking about ways that we meaningfully redeploy that skill set, those people who are in those positions. And so for us, and the ways in which we will use artificial intelligence in the newsroom, a recent study looked and found that in the United States, 80% of news organizations were already using artificial intelligence. And this was a study from about a year ago. That number has only gone higher in the intervening time period. We can use this in ways, the kind of mind-numbing work of doing sports box scores, or doing financial results, or doing things that are important, where accuracy is crucial and important, but also might not be the best use of skills. Artificial intelligence will allow us to do complicated investigations. It will allow us to do stories that require insight and technical expertise much quicker than we could before. And so in some ways, we can utilize this as a way of reimagining what it is to be a journalist. Moreover, there is a point to be thought of even in the issue of distrust. And so when we talk about news, we just spent a good part of the day kind of interacting with various parts of media here in Jordan, here in Amman, and we've heard the word broadcast tossed around very many times, and I always think about this word because it's an unusual word. It's actually a strange word. We think of this now, we have podcasts, we have simulcasts, we have all kinds of casts. You can cast anything, and so, as a matter of fact, when I was going through titles, I was trying to find a title for this talk, and I said, broadcast no stone. Get it? Yeah, it was bad. That's why I didn't use it. And so, we think of this as so rooted in our technology that it is a technical term. But broadcast, the origins of this word, are actually agricultural. And it means exactly what it says. Cast, meaning to throw, broadly. Broadcast was a word that we used to refer to the practice of farmers taking seeds and broadly casting them out into a field. And so sowing seeds in a particular way was known as broadcasting them. And we took that as an analogy when the new technologies of radio and television emerged. We took that agricultural analogy and applied it to what we were doing verbally and journalistically. We were broadly casting information out to the public. The nature of our landscape is that we're no longer broadly casting, or rather, we may be broadly casting, but people are broadly casting back. What was once a monologue has become a dialogue. The evolving distrust in the media organizations across the world is, on its face, not a bad thing. Each year, when we welcome the incoming class of students at Columbia Journalism School, we teach them the importance of fairness, being fair, being accurate, being timely, being ethical. We teach them all of the principles of journalism, and we arm them with a general degree of skepticism. If someone tells you something, check it out. Double check, triple check. The old saying, if your mother tells you that she loves you, check it out. And so everything is subject to scrutiny and should be subject to scrutiny. It would be hypocritical of us to not want the public to apply that same standard in our direction. So the problem is not simply distrust of media. The problem is that we would like that distrust to be applied equally across all sources of information. And that is why, as we move forward, we have to place more value in fact-checking and media literacy. These have to become bedrock portions of both journalism education and general education. The public should be equipped with the tools to discern, well, this is a claim, this product claims that if I use it, within 7 days, I will have a full head of hair. I could spend, yeah, exactly. We've both been through this. None of them worked, by the way. But we want to have the general degree of skepticism applied not only to us, but to the purveyors of misinformation and disinformation. Now, the difficulty here is that misinformation and disinformation very often tell people what they want to hear. Even if it's bad news, even if it's terrible, it confirms our worst suspicions. But even when your worst suspicions are confirmed, you derive the relief of knowing that you were at least right. And so the rubric of skepticism, how do you know this? How did you come about this information? Could I verify this? What are the mechanisms for this? And so that equal standard should help the public discern the difference between high quality, vetted, timely, accurate information and the kind of propagandistic, untrue information, or I won't say information, but words and content that are directed at us. In addition, the threats that journalists face are significant and substantial. It's notable to me, however, that this is a departure, that we're seeing an increase from the baseline. Now, this profession involves telling people, as I just said, very often telling people things that they don't want you to know, or telling people things that others don't want the public to know. There's always been an element of danger, but it has never been so convenient and so comfortable to attack the press as it is in this particular moment. There's no easy solution to this, but one step has to be that we use our voices relentlessly and consistently on behalf of those who have been killed while conducting their work. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of organizations like Forbidden Stories. Forbidden Stories is a grassroots organization based in France which takes up the work of journalists who have been killed. If a journalist is killed, in order to silence them, more journalists will show up to finish the story that person was working on. And this is fundamentally a means of not only informing the public, but sending a message that it is futile to simply kill the messenger, because it will do nothing to impede the delivery of the actual message. Additionally, journalism itself must be above reproach. When I'm in a room and people eventually begin talking about the lack of trust in the public, my standard response is, why should they trust us? We have to earn the trust of the public every day. And we do that by being relentlessly ethical, by double and triple checking every bit of work that we produce. And crucially, by making the occasional mistake and quickly owning up to it. It is important to recognize that any uncorrected mistake, any attempt to place our thumb on the scale of a preferred social outcome, any perceived bias will only further a narrative that the media cannot be trusted in the first place, that we have an agenda, and that we are just part of a bigger ecosystem that is attempting to drive people to act in one manner or another. And finally, journalism education must be accessible to all, even those who we do not typically think of as journalists. And in this regard, I am really thankful for all of the people doing this work, and I'm eager about the conversations I've had with Her Royal Highness and the Jordan Media Institute about making sure that as many people as possible understand how journalism works. One, it is easier to trust us when you know what we actually do. And this is a self-inflicted wound. We have not done the best job of explaining to the public, of explaining to the world how journalism actually works. I have one simple solution that I promote all the time. Whenever we publish a story, particularly a story that has any kind of controversial claim or any kind of could be cause of any controversy or dissension, we should include a link that says how this story was reported. For me, when I report for The New Yorker, I always have to send a file of all my reporting over to the fact checkers. Everyone knows about the legendary toughness of New Yorker fact checkers. I have compared it to being fact-checked at the New Yorker. I have compared it to being audited by the Internal Revenue Service at the same time as you're getting a root canal. And so at least that is the feeling. But I send over all that information to say how I reported every single paragraph that is here. There's evidence. I talked to this person, I interviewed this person, I got this file, I got this document, and then this person gave me this quote, and so on. So if you were so inclined, you could replicate the story that I produced. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm actually showing you how I did this work. One of my colleagues, who is a documentary filmmaker, has begun a practice at her company, at her news organization, in which they produce a documentary. The doc may be 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours, and after they put the documentary up for viewing, they put all of the interviews, the entire set of interviews. And so if you want to know the context in which the person gave this quote, which showed up in the documentary, you can listen to the 10 minutes before and the 10 minutes after. You can listen to the whole 2-hour interview if you're so inclined. We're not asking the public to trust us. If you're interested, you can view this yourself and see exactly where this story came from. And finally, much of the work of journalism will be done by people whom we do not typically consider journalists in the future. These will be people who, equipped with a social media account or using whatever technology they find available to them, are simply trying to tell the story of what they saw, of what happened in their community, what happened in their country, what happened in their small portion of the world. We, as journalism educators, have to open the doors to provide people like that with the basic knowledge of journalism ethics, the basic understanding of journalism law, the basic fundamental understanding of the technologies of journalism, and for my part, just a little bit of the history of journalism so you understand how we came to this place. So, I'm sorry to say that I gave you a bit of false advertising at the beginning of this talk. I have in fact not solved all of our problems. The things that I have proposed are necessary but will be insufficient. There'll be other practices and other ideas that we have to come up with. There'll be other challenges that will emerge on the horizon. I think about that acutely as we look ahead to the inauguration of the new president of the United States, who has outwardly expressed his antagonism toward media and toward journalism. And so there'll be new concerns and new questions that we will have to confront as we attempt to navigate our way through this moment. But I do believe that we have the will, we have the talent, and we have the commitment to address these concerns, to make sure that the journalism which has helped secure the freedoms that we enjoy currently is healthy and thriving and available to do the same for subsequent generations of us, as yet unborn. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jelani, for this wonderful and truly inspiring talk. I think everybody, I'm sure, will walk out of here much more optimistic than they walked in. So that's always good. But also, I think you laid out some of the challenges, but I think also some of the opportunities that are ahead of us, particularly as we think of new technologies, new venues, new communication methodologies, and so on. I think we are open to questions from the audience. Okay, so maybe I will start with you, and then please introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I'm Samar Kreide from Lebanon. I have a background in international relations and diplomacy, and I currently work in communication. Talking about misinformation. If I place the number 6 between both of you, you would see it maybe as a 6, but you would see it as a 9. For both of you, you're just trying to tell the story you're saying. It's not having the intent of sharing any misinformation, you're just reporting it the way you're saying it. So how can a journalist ensure that they do not fall into the trap of misinformation when trying to cover a story as it is, ensuring that they are being objective?
The journalist is supposed to go around to the back and see how it looks from that perspective too. And it's an easy thing to say, but it has to become a habit of mind. It's an easy thing in practice to overlook. But you know, I tell this story all the time. It's a very New York-oriented story. But you know, I was on an airplane. So at the beginning of baseball season in 2018, a good friend of mine who lives in Los Angeles, we talked and we said that no matter who won, we were going to go to, who was playing, we were going to go to the World Series that year. As fate would have it, the Dodgers were in the World Series that year, so he didn't have to go anywhere. But I had to fly from New York to Los Angeles to see this game. As I'm flying out, there's a game being played as I'm on the plane, and you know, I'm sitting next to the guy, he's watching the game, we start talking, he's from Brooklyn, he's a Yankee fan. I'm from Queens, I'm a Yankee fan. The Red Sox are playing in the World Series. Anyone who knows anything about American baseball knows that Yankee fans and Red Sox fans cannot be in the same room at any time. One of the great contemptuous rivalries of all time. And then, very strangely enough, the actor Gary Busey sat down next to us, and I don't know why. He was just on a flight to Los Angeles, and he saw we were watching the game. And so the three of us began talking. And the Red Sox score, and the guy from Brooklyn cheers, and I don't know what is happening. I'm like, wait, why, wait, how can you, are you cheering for the Red Sox? And he said, yes. And I said, how could any Yankee fan ever cheer for the Red Sox? And he said, because the Red Sox beat the Yankees. They eliminated the Yankees in order to get to the World Series. I said, yes, exactly. And he said, well, if the Red Sox win the World Series, it means that the Yankees lost to the best team in baseball. And they are theoretically, possibly the second best team this year. But if the Red Sox lose to the Dodgers, it means the Yankees lost to the second best team, and at best, they're the third best team in baseball this year. So because I'm a Yankee fan, I'm cheering for the Red Sox to win. Now, I thought this was the product of a very sick mind. I did have to admit, however, that his logic was sound. And I tell my students that story all the time, that people can come to a position that you find completely inscrutable, or even sometimes immoral, through a chain of reasoning that makes sense in their particular circumstance. Doesn't mean that they're right, but it means that we have to withhold the presumption that if I look at this number and I see a 6, that number is always going to look like a 6 to all people across all time, in all perspectives.
I mean, it's interesting. I have to say, even after having lived in the United States for 30 years, I know nothing about baseball, but but I guess
all you need to know is that the Red Sox are terrible.
Okay, thank you. But I think I figured out a lot. Maybe I wanted to build on something you said, and then we'll go to your question, is how much do you think this lack of trust for journalism is part of just this whole movement against intellectuals, against facts, against knowledge? I mean, we see it not just only against journalists, but also against many, many, many other professions. I mean, is there something bigger here than just the crisis that? that you described that's relevant to journalists?
I think there is something bigger, but it's not simply that. I think that we see broader distrust in institutions in general.
Correct. Yeah.
And
Yes.
I think that people know more about how institutions operate than they did previously. And on some level, maybe there was too much trust before, that it could be useful to us. In another regard, I think that one of the challenges of media is that we have tended to overestimate the most important parts of our job. And what I mean by that is, if you talk to journalists, they're going to tell you about investigative reporting, war coverage, accountability reporting, reporting on an industry that maybe is doing something that causes health consequences for the public, all those kinds of things. That is not what draws most people to the news. Yeah. Most people have a much more kind of utility-driven relationship. They want to know, the basic things that they need to know about their everyday life. And the closer you can get to that person's everyday life, the more likely you are to be trusted. And so if you are talking about the football scores for this particular high school in this particular community, or if you're talking about a festival that has happened in this particular neighborhood and at this particular time, those are things that actually draw the public into a closer relationship with a news organization. And they're essential. So in the United States, one of the things that we're seeing is the growth of nonprofit news and news organizations. And the American Journalism Project, where I mentioned I'm on the board, we see every day dozens of applications, and the word investigative shows up in all of them. And I'm like, that's great, investigative is important. I really need to know who's going to report on the local high school. Yeah. Because once you do that, you have to do that in order for people to have enough trust in you to take your word when they say you tell them something bigger. Right.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, there was another question here. Is there a microphone or? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Khalid Abdelmajid. I'm a retired fund manager and therefore a big user of news. One of the things I'm concerned about is the impact of money on not being partisan, on objectivity. And you're seeing that at universities, sadly as well, at Columbia, and you're seeing it in the newspapers, you're seeing it on the social media platforms. And so my guess is that we need a change in regulations. And I wanted to see your opinion on that.
I'm not going to argue about that. Yeah, I think that's essential. That's one of the things that I think, the kind of, particularly in the U.S., which I can speak about most directly, the kind of unregulated growth of money and the way that it is kind of deployed in various places has been one of the reasons that it's been so difficult for institutions to function in the way that they're supposed to, including news organizations. And so there are things like, people saw likely the Washington Post refusing to endorse Kamala Harris, the Los Angeles Times refusing to endorse Kamala Harris, the removal of the public relations team from the Washington Post, the fact that ABC News paid Donald Trump $15 million to settle a lawsuit that they probably would have won. And so that raises the real question of, what was that $15 million really doing? And these are news organizations. And so their audiences should, when we say the skepticism is important, their audiences should look at them and ask, will you cover this administration truthfully if the person who owns the newspaper gives $1 million to the inauguration fund? And those are real valid questions. If news reporters are not supposed to advocate, and we're not supposed to go to rallies, we're not supposed to go to protests, we're not supposed to speak on behalf of whichever political candidate we want to vote for, then newspaper owners probably shouldn't give money to political candidates on that scale either.
I'm just wondering about the, you mentioned something interesting, which is the value of very hyper-local information to gain trust. And I'm wondering whether that's what's driving kind of a bit of a movement away from hard news to softer news as well.
Well, I think that's part of it. Also, I mean, news avoidance, which we didn't even talk about, where people just check out of the news.
Right.
And, I am not in a position to be judgmental about that because after the US election, I checked out of the news for about a week, and I run a journalism school. And so I still needed a week. People were telling me things were happening. I was like, really, did that happen? And so I get that. The other part of it is that there's a problem that has to be finessed. You don't want to sugarcoat things for people. And at the same time, it can be really difficult to engage with the news because it is bad story after bad story after bad story. The headline says, the world is over, we're all gonna die. And then you get to sports and it's like, and your team lost. And so when we're in a situation like that, people will rightfully say that I can't engage much more of this. And so we have to figure out
where's the balance?
Where the balance is.
The balance is, yeah. There was a question. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Mossad Razouki, Columbia University Medical Center and Columbia Business School, 2008. So I have two questions. The first one, as particularly the governments and the economies of the GCC and other Arab economies move towards, let's say, modernization, the fourth estate seems to be left behind. In some countries, actually in retrograde in terms of civil liberties. What advice do you have to leaders or even journalists and citizens who are losing hope about encouraging free speech? And the second one is a little bit more difficult question. Why are the comics...
More difficult than that?
Yes. Why are the comics in the New Yorker so... Why are they not funny?
Oh, the comics in New York.
Oh, I think they're very funny.
So, and then, well, I'll take those in the order. The difficult question first. I think that some questions that we confront, I think that someone dropped their cell phone.
That's mine.
Oh, sure, it's okay. Some questions, I think, as it relates to kind of press freedom, it's important to think about the fact that most of these things, we talked about kind of internationally, them not happening in sync with each other, but moving in the same general direction. And I think it's because these questions were grappled with internationally. I don't think that we can resolve any of these things kind of in individual spaces. It's kind of like the question that labor movements faced, as kind of capital began to, in the era of globalism, like how do you protect the rights of workers when capital moves all over the globe? And so the answer to that is that you have to organize internationally. And I think that is part of what I meant when I said we have to all raise our voices around this. At Columbia, what this meant in our small way was that last year from January, from the spring semester, we placed a memorial for all the journalists who had died in the Middle East in that time frame. And so anytime someone walked in, and this was at that time in the 80s, less than 90 people, we now see that number is much larger. But anytime somebody walked into the building, they got the reminder that this many journalists had been killed. And so fortunately for us, we have a cross-section of very significant people who come into our building, and they were seeing that we were keeping tabs of the number of people who have died in the pursuit of this work. And I think that, we do win sometimes. We don't win all the time, and that those victories are very difficult to achieve, but we know from history that they are achievable. And in some instances, they've been achieved under more difficult circumstances than the ones we're facing right now. As it relates to the New Yorker, David Remnick once said that every week he publishes at least one cartoon that he doesn't totally get. And so the editor-in-chief is like, I don't get this, but I'm going to go with it. I think that that's the best attitude to engage with the New Yorker comics with.
I'm wondering, I know at your school there's several journalists who've been featuring or highlighting this issue of empathetic journalism, and it might be of interest for the audience to learn more about what that is, particularly in the current context. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a couple things. If we go back to even, outside of the, journalists at the school, but back to the Dart Center where we were talking about the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which has really been at the forefront of something called trauma-informed journalism, which is to say that when we show up with our cameras and our microphones and our notepads, we are very often going to something where a person has been traumatized. If you were just writing about a car accident, the person who was in that accident, even if they have no major injuries, is probably going to be shaken up. And it just goes from there to all sorts of things that have emotional implications for the people that we cover. And so it begins by starting with the kind of fundamental empathy that recognizes that this person, that you are actually dealing with a human being. I remember at the beginning of my career, I would feel guilty because there were some points where I would not attempt to interview someone. And we were taught interview, interview, interview at all costs. If the person is a complete mess and they're crying and they're emotionally shaken up, if you can get them to talk to you, and I just wouldn't do that. I didn't feel like that was, as a human, I felt like I was not doing my job. It's fortunate that we've seen evolution now, and the Dart Center has been very key to this, by recognizing that you are not doing your job by further traumatizing that person, and that the mere interaction can sometimes be an additional burden. In addition to that, we also turn that empathy at ourselves, because the other part of that idea was that we were supposed to relentlessly cover car accident after casualty of war, after murder victim, after just all these things, and that none of that actually affected us. That we were these impassive robots, essentially. And that we had to actually grapple with the fact that journalism as a profession can be traumatizing to people who practice it. And so, what does that look like? And so I think that that's only made journalism better, and it only has given us a better vantage point to interact with the people whose stories we're telling. And the one thing that I will say, and I'll bring this up, because I generally, whenever I go anywhere, I get a question about this, but last year, when we saw the large-scale protests at Columbia, there are lots of things that I could say about that experience. One of the, I see Jude in the back there. And so a lot of things, I can say a lot of things about that experience. One of the most important was that we had the tables turned. We're accustomed to covering people, and now we were being covered. And we got to see what that felt like. And so I was like, think about that. Think about what it feels like when someone comes up to you and wants to ask you a question, and you have other things, the things that are important to you, and you're thinking about something else in your life and all those things. I had colleagues who were really good journalists, people who were ethical, who I would place my trust in a minute, who nonetheless got things wrong. And because I know these people, I know that they weren't trying to further some other agenda. I would call, I would say, hey, that quote that you got from that person, that wasn't true. You should look at this, call this person, so on. You can get a correction. And I did that more than once. And I can only imagine if I was a person who didn't know these people, I would assume that they had done this out of malice. And so the experience of being covered is really crucial to us, in terms of understanding what we subject other people to.
Other questions, please. Yes.
Hello, my name is Sara Al-Yahya. I'm a master's student in human rights and the arts at Bard College. And I come from a creative technology background, but now kind of entering into journalism by way of open source intelligence. And so I had a few questions about that because I got really interested in learning the skills, like learning how to geolocate, all of these things. But from the point of view of a traditional journalist, I kind of want to know how you perceive the role of the aesthetics of data or the aesthetics of complexity that leads people to believe that things are true, because I think this is a problem in OSINT now, where people engage in like kind of bad data work, but because it has a red circle on it and an arrow and like something, people believe it. I don't know. How do you deal with these kinds of reports in traditional journalism?
I was just thinking, maybe we'll take two questions and then we'll come to you. Yeah. There's one right near you. Yes.
Okay, my name is Kermel Al-Madi. Okay, I'm a fourth-year journalism student at the University of Middle East. So if we are admitting that there is a correlation between the loss of trust and misinformation, what about misinformation spread by news outlets themselves? So if we have a very well-known, well-established news network that was called out for purposely spreading misinformation, especially regarding human rights violation issues or conflicts, do they even deserve a chance for another chance at trust? And if so, how can they go about in regaining back that trust?
About the OSINT question, one, I think that the open source intelligence, or what we call OSINT, is one of the most exciting things. When I was talking about innovation, that's one of them. We're doing, blurring the lines now between journalism and computer science, or doing, forensic examinations that, really push the boundaries of how we think about journalism imaginatively. And I think that simplicity has its own kind of appeal. One of the things that is a common trait of people who attempt to misinform the public is that they're easily understood. And they give people simplicity. And that is often a fundamental element of misinformation. In fact, sometimes it's distrustful. You can be distrustful precisely because it is so simple when we're dealing with complicated problems. The best that we can do, the best that we can hope to do as journalists is meet people where they are. Our real skill set is translation. We're supposed to be able to stand in the middle. That's also, there's another point. I didn't want to bore you to death with all my etymology, but media derives from the Latin term that means middle. Like, we are supposed to be in the middle between whatever it is, the complicated things that are going on up here, and the average person who really does not have the time to engage with. They have all of the intelligence and all the skills, they don't have the time. And what we have that they don't have is time and the resources to go answer this question. And so it's like, in exchange, we're going to give you this information. In exchange for your patronage, we're going to actually read all of these reports for you and distill down what they mean. At the same time, on the level of saying, and this ties in the second question as well, I think that when things are inaccurate, they should be pointed out by other journalism organizations, by other news organizations, particularly when we mentioned earlier the importance of fact-checking. There have to be neutral third-party fact-checkers that aren't aligned necessarily with any news organization, but are organizations in their own right. And this is, again, not asking the public to trust, but saying, we will give you the information about why this is wrong, and if you're so inclined, you can check it yourself. And so that, I think, is crucial to kind of navigating the situation that we're in now. And I also, at Columbia, we publish Columbia Journalism Review, which is our outlet for doing that. We look at, what's happening in the journalism world, what are the best practices, who is doing something that we should emulate, who's doing something we should definitely not emulate, and those kinds of things. And that's what we do at Columbia, our attempt to practice what we preach.
I mean, what do you think about the whole challenge of the algorithms that essentially drive people to just be in one path, that kind of limit the ability of people to actually pursue seeking knowledge from other sources?
There's a solution to this, having just railed against simplicity. There's a solution to this that is deceptively simple but has yet to be widely deployed, which is that people in the tech world have long been advocating public interest algorithms. That you have proprietary algorithms that are generated to do what social media wants you to do. It's geared to strike the core, most primitive parts of our brains. Things that are going to
amplify that.
And amplify that, right. Yeah. But public interest algorithms would be, just in theory, geared toward driving our curiosity or driving our empathy or other kinds of things that we think of as societal virtues, or simply helping you find the most efficient answer to the question that you have. And so outside of that motivation, what does the internet look like? What does social media look like? And we haven't seen that solution. We haven't really seen that even attempted at scale. Yeah. So, we don't know how well that could potentially even work.
That's very interesting, yeah. Yes, please, and then I'll go to you. Yes, go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thank you. My name is Bayan Ittal. I'm a media literacy and communication consultant. Frankly, I mean, this lecture could have been more suitable in the West, in any other country, but I find it a bit tone deaf for this part of the world. I mean, when you talk about, fault lines and deadlines and rebuilding trust, you didn't mention why the media in the United States is not trusted, why there is such a huge decline. It's probably because of the way that you've been covering everything, and because of the polarization that's happening in your own media. We know why trust in our media is declining, but I was hoping that you would tell us why it's declining in the West. I was also hoping that you would talk about what Columbia Journalism School is doing in terms of what it's doing with its students regarding the protests by the students in Columbia, and how the university has been dealing with professors, and lately the professor who resigned after 25 years at service.
Professor Frankie,
yes.
who is a friend of mine, yes.
Yes.
Well, okay, if I can answer that question, because I want to make sure we grapple with that.
Yeah.
So I think that the reasons, that trust has declined in media in the United States, as I said, I tend to view that a little bit differently. I don't think that the distrust in the media is a bad thing, necessarily, and that it could be in response to mistakes that the media has made. Now, the reasons that trust has declined are, if we just talk about the United States as an example, one, I don't think that what's happening in the United States is happening exclusive to other places. That's why I mentioned the Reuters report that looked at 40 countries. So initially, that was how I looked at it. I was looking at the United States as if it was exceptional in particular, and then being kind of self-critical by thinking that the United States is the only example I need to think about. I then began thinking about, well, this is happening in 39 other countries. What are the commonalities? And so that was what I was attempting to address. if we wanted to talk about the specificity of trust declining in the United States, there are a number of different factors. I don't know which weighs the most. I'm not sure anyone knows which weighs the most, but the decline of local news in the United States has been one of the driving forces in the loss of trust in media. Also, I just mentioned, what I think to be the unethical behavior of the owners of the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the leadership of ABC News. I could go on, but that was why I mentioned that explicitly, to say that I don't think that their behavior suggests that those news organizations are prepared to actually report on the incoming Trump administration. I think that's part of the reason when you see something like that, people begin to lose trust. When they killed the endorsement of Kamala Harris in the Washington Post, 250,000 people canceled their subscriptions in a week. That is a huge number for the Washington Post and suggests the erosion of trust and their willingness to do what they're supposed to do as a news organization. That said, some of the decline of trust in news has been driven by partisan attacks for things that the media is generally not guilty of. And so if you look at the data in the United States, the decline is not symmetrical. So people who are liberal or left-leaning have had a somewhat of a drop of their decrease in their trust in media. People who are conservative have had a precipitous drop in their trust in media. At the same token, we have seen outlets like Fox News, which in my estimation is not a news organization. I've said this very many times publicly. I hesitate to say it because they do hire our graduates, but I also have to be honest and be truthful. I do not consider them a news organization. If conservatives overwhelmingly trust an organization that penalized its reporters and had for reporting on the outcome of the 2020 presidential election and had to pay $800 million in a defamation suit, and that is the news source that people do trust, that conservatives do trust, then I don't want to do the thing that gets them to trust us. And so if that's the case, that lack of trust in us doesn't say much about us. It says more about them than it says about us. All of these things are happening simultaneously and mixed in. And so I appreciate your criticism. I don't think that I'm above criticism. I never do. And so in attempting to craft this talk, I was trying to talk about the biggest, most commonality, the biggest kind of broadest commonalities of what people are seeing in media landscapes around the world, and not the kind of specificity of what's happening in Jordan or what's happening in the United States. I was kind of trying to go for the biggest picture. The students. So as I said, when every talk that I give, anywhere I go in the world, people bring this up. When I was in the UK, when I was in Tokyo, that always comes up. And so I wasn't, I was anticipating that would come up during the question and answer period. But I'm more than willing to talk about anything that's happened at Columbia University. I've been one of the people that has been outspoken about saying that the university has strayed from its principles of free speech and academic freedom. During the protests, when the campus was shut down, the university had simultaneously effectively barred reporters from being able to get on the campus and report about what was happening. And the journalism school sent our students and our faculty. The rule was you couldn't come in unless you had a Columbia ID. If you had a Columbia ID, you could bring someone in to the campus. And so we sent our students and our faculty. Anyone who sent us a direct message on our social media that was a credentialed reporter, we sent our students and our faculty and our staff out to go get them and bring them onto the campus. And we brought about 100 journalists in over the course of those weeks to make sure that that story could be reported as accurately as possible. And so I think that, we're at a point, I've had a lot of careers. Prior to being a dean of a journalism school, and I was a Cold War historian. And one of the commonalities I see between that time period and this one is the pressure applied to institutions that pushes people to abandon what their professed principles are. And I think that in those moments, there are, unfortunately, a minority of people who are willing to stand up and defend those principles. And those people tend to suffer disproportionately for it. And I think pretty consistently, pretty constantly about the conversations that I've had with other faculty members besides Catherine Franke, but people who were thinking about what kinds of consequences they're prepared to deal with if they take a stand for academic freedom or freedom of the press that is not rewarded, especially given the intimidation that the incoming administration has already tried to impose. And if I'm just finally, I'll tell you who I am, which is that I spent the first portion of my life studying the history of the Black freedom struggle in the United States. And as this emerged, I told one of my closest colleagues, I didn't spend all that time in the library to be afraid of these people. That's how I see this.
Thank you. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. I am a communication student. I wanted to ask you a bit of a longer question. Talking about disinformation has in itself become a discourse. These last two questions were part of it. It's everywhere on social media. There are businesses like Ground News whose entire job is just telling you where disinformation is. And so, for example, when Kamala Harris did an interview with 60 Minutes, 60 Minutes usually does interviews that are chopped up like that, but because people want to talk about disinformation, they started blaming the platform. So negative discourse tends to do better on social media than positive discourse, and that brings up kind of another incentive for people not to trust media because they want to do better, they want to get a higher reach, they want to talk about, Fox News wants to call every other network the mainstream media so they can appear like the alternative media. Joe Rogan has 50 million views, but tries to appear as alternative, as anti-establishment. So how is improving literacy and accessibility, the solutions you kind of talked about, gonna combat that when there is other incentives to us talking about disinformation because it became a discourse in itself?
And thank you for that question. I'll also add that the very language of disinformation has been weaponized and used by people who tend to promote disinformation. If you hear anything that Elon Musk says, his view of the world appears to be upside down. That what proves to be factually inaccurate seems to be information. And the things that are questionable are treated as if they are, the gospel truth. And so, there's that dynamic too. Fundamentally, I think that all of these principles that we're talking about rely upon a particular faith in human beings. That if human beings have the tools and they have the analytical abilities and the trainings and skill sets, that they can make good decisions about things. Which is why I said the problem is not so much that they don't trust media. The problem is that they bestow trust upon other types of outlets that don't deserve their trust. And so what I have advocated is be skeptical of all of us. And through your skepticism, ask more questions. And I'm confident that not always, but in the majority of the time, if people are asking tough questions of everyone, that we will win out more often than not.
I'm wondering that, okay, I think my time is running out, but we'll take your question back. But I'm wondering whether, part of the challenge also is short attention span. and people are looking for simplicity and the kind of rigor that's required by the consumers themselves to be able to do what you just said, not trust, seek, look for diversity of views and so on, is kind of clashes with the moment when people just want the very short message. So how do we deal with this, and how do we try to meet people where they're at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a challenge for us, but I don't feel that way, feel in the same way that I think a lot of people do, which is that this is an agnostic skill set. You know, the people who are giving bad information or disinformation can tell things very simply in a short time frame. Yeah. That doesn't mean that we can't do the same thing. It's more challenging for us because we're constrained by actual reality, and we have things that...
And reality is complex.
And reality is complex. Yeah. But I also think that we should practice writing haiku. You know, I think that we should think about the most succinct way that we present information. Yeah. And I don't think that's beyond us. Yeah. You know?
And I think it's something that's certainly in my world of scientists and so on, and a lesson learned from COVID-19 is that the communication skills were often not very well developed. We know how to communicate to each other, but not to the broader community. And I think we paid the price for it. There's one last question, way in the back there. Maybe if you have a short question, we can take this other person's question too, okay?
Okay. And I'll give as short an answer as I can.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll do my best, sorry. My name is Maya Abu Ali, I'm a writer. My question actually ties into what you were asking, especially when it comes to this era of instant gratification and skimming headlines, essentially. Oftentimes I'll read a very rigorous report for a very credible, by the way, thank you for coming. I'll read a very rigorous report by a supposedly high-ranking, credible publisher, and it's the headline that throws us off the most. And this is concerning for the reason that you just stated. They'll deploy passive voice, they'll skew things, whereas the reporter itself doesn't have any jurisdiction over the headline, so they'll have like a very...
That's right.
How do you teach your students how to grapple with the entrenched legacy publishing biases that might alter how stories are presented?
Constant battle. Okay, sorry.
Go ahead, there's somebody. No, you have to make it very short.
My name is Khalid. I mean, just I think maybe building on some of the points, you know, we've seen, I think, in this part of the world how media organizations beat the drums of war. I mean, I think that's.
I think how media organizations what?
Beat the drums of war.
Oh, yeah.
I think, you know, prior to the invasion of Iraq, and I think definitely, I think in this war post-October, we have seen, I think, the propaganda, you know, aspect of media organization. So I would like to actually hear a prognosis from you on why, you know, where you think the massive influence on the reporting on Palestine comes from, and where you think, you know, milestones can be done in that regard.
Thank you.
So for the first question, that is a constant struggle. And, you know, we dissect news stories, we pull things apart, we look at like what's wrong with headlines, and, you know, you'll sometimes see a terrible headline, complete passive voice, no one actually did anything, like something just happened, like snow falling from the sky, and no one had anything to do with it. And then a very straightforward, succinct, to the point headline, and you will compare them, sometimes in the same news organization, sometimes in the same day. And one of the things I'm told is that because of, you know, when I've talked with people on the other side of this, one of the things that they've said in response is that because news organizations are very often so strapped now, that there is less attention paid to those things. And that's a very convenient response. It's like, this is, how we do this. We're doing the best we can with smaller budgets, et cetera, et cetera. I've noticed that those kinds of passive voice things tend to be the most politically convenient. I think it's something that you have to raise your voice to, at least with me, when I talk with people, especially if you are a freelancer, talk about that up front. What is my headline going to be? I'm at the point now where, like my editors already know, we discuss like what my headline is going to be. That may be a difficult thing for people to do early in their career, but it is something that people should raise. Like, this is the story, what's the headline, what is the subheader on this, and so on. On the question of, what are the driving forces in the coverage of, the war in Gaza, I think it has been, what we've seen, in other instances. It would be probably reminiscent, in the United States at least, of the way that the media covered the Iraq War, which is to say mainstream media laid down on the job. It was, again, like snow falling from the sky. Nobody actually did anything, like a war just emerged. Incredulously believed, the ideas about weapons of mass destruction and all these other kind of things that led the drumbeat of war. I don't think that that's unique. I don't think that that's kind of atypical. I think that this moment has been particularly intense, given the scale of civilian casualties. But it has also been, if I'm just being honest, people who I've talked to who are reporting who have had fights internally, and we could talk privately about that, the things that people have told me that they've witnessed and they've heard, that they've seen in their newsrooms. And my feeling is that the people who are most likely to fight against the kinds of indefensible flaws in the coverage that we've seen are also the people who are incredibly vulnerable in this moment. And that's just, I don't know, I wish I could say like I've reported on this and like this happened and there was this memo that was sent or this lawyer. I don't know on that level. I presume that at some point maybe those things will come out. But I can tell you that there are just a lot of conscientious reporters who feel like they've spent the past, 15 months now, running into a brick wall and then getting up and running into that same brick wall and then getting up and running into a brick wall and then going home and then the next morning getting up and doing it all over again.
And maybe as a last question to you, Jelani, because I think we've run out of time. Hania is looking at me very sternly.
I mean, I'll be available for, like, if people want to talk more after.
We're going to have a reception, yeah. But I'm sure there are young people in the audience who are considering becoming journalists or becoming engaged in this discipline. What advice would you give them? Yeah.
I would say that despite all of the kinds of challenges and the problems and the things that I mentioned, this is still a deeply important line of work, and that journalism won't solve any of the world's problems, but none of the world's problems will be solved without journalism. And the work that we do, we're kind of like lawyers. I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be a lawyer, and he said, it's terrible because law is this honorable profession, but people only think about like the dishonorable people who are in it. Someone says law, you're like, oh, okay, shady lawyer or whatever. And so, as journalists, we've had to bear the brunt of, the kind of worst of our profession. But one of the benefits of my job is that I see the best of my profession. And each day I interact with several hundred really smart, really talented, amazing young people who want to go out and report. And they want to go out and do this not because they think they're going to get rich, not because they think that they're going to own, 3 homes, and vacation in the most luxurious places. They do this because they think people's lives depend on it and that they can make the world better in some way. And that remains an incredibly valid reason to pursue this work.
And on this wonderful note of optimism and excitement, I want to thank you very much, Jelani, for coming here to Amman Global Center and finally, so thank you. And thank you all for coming to this evening event. And please join us for reception outside and there'll be more conversation. Thank you.